If you've gone through the process of setting all that jazz up locally, and then you experience what it looks like doing that with Gitpod, it's a near magical experience.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 189. Code anywhere, on any device, with Gitpod. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, you know that I recently moved from a MacBook Air 2011 vintage to a Mac Studio.
After convincing you for a couple of years.
Couple of years. Well, Mac Studio not that long, but yes, moving on. But the one thing I could always pull off on my MacBook Air, I could use VI, which wasn't horrible, but then I needed to actually do real work on it. And even VS Code locally wasn't that great. It was fine, but it wasn't great. But a few years ago, we ran across this thing called Gitpod, and it changed all of our lives. Because even on that little low-powered 2011 MacBook Air, I had a full IDE that I could work with. And that was great. So on today's show, we have Chris on from Gitpod. Chris, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
What made you guys think about creating Gitpod?
Just in case somebody is not familiar with Gitpod, before saying what made you create it, maybe what it is.
Maybe I'll start with the mission of the company. Our mission is to make software development frictionless, joyful, and secure. And the frictionless is sort of the biggest giveaway. So what we do is we take all the yuck shaving and the hoops that you need to jump through before you can start writing code out of writing code. So say you want to contribute to an open source project or you join a company, you're going to spend hours, if not days, producing the initial setup of your development environment. And then you're going to continue to spend time massaging that environment. So our customers tell us, and studies show that that's to the tune of 5 to 10 hours per week per developer that we'll be spending just updating software, making sure we got the right version, just to be able to do the work that we actually want to do. And so Gitpod reduces that to seconds. And it does that by providing multiple ephemeral development environments, each for a particular task. So say you want to review a PR, or you want to work on a feature, you'll open a Gitpod for that particular task, and you'll get a development environment that you can connect to from your browser, but also your desktop, that is perfectly set up for that task. It has the tools that you need to have. It has the code checked out in the correct revision. It has potentially that code already built, the tests run, all of that. Gitpod gives you ready-to-code development environments that run in the cloud that you can connect to from your browser or your desktop machine.
So your competitor is Apple, really?
To some extent.
Trying to kill MacBook Pro business.
I'm not sure. Like there's a lot of good things about MacBook Pros. It's funny though. You would say that one thing that we do see is that with the switch to ARM in MacBooks, we do see some folks struggling with that, where they want to run software that just doesn't run on ARM, especially in a Docker container. So Oracle, you can't run Oracle on ARM in Docker right now. So if you have an M1 or M2 Mac and you need to work with Oracle, you don't have that many options in doing that locally. And so we do see folks who have that requirement come to Gitpod because at the end it's an x86 machine that you get to use, and so that problem goes away.
So at this point today, you're only doing x86 and
That's
no
right.
ARM. That's interesting. Well, it makes sense, right? Because x86 has been around since the dawn of time. But where do you think ARM is really happening? We're going to go on a bunny trail here for just a second.
Yeah, it's a good question.
How much is ARM really impacting what, as developers, we have to do?
So I think the biggest impact that we've seen so far is exactly the MacBooks. Like I made the switch to an M1 as soon as it came out, and it fundamentally changed how I think about that machine. I no longer want to warm up my coffee on it, and I don't worry that it's going to run out of battery. I'll go through a whole day of conference on a single charge easily. So I think that, from that practical perspective, that's been the biggest impact. And then I haven't been developing locally in the past 4 years, so I can't speak to the pain that would induce doing that on an ARM machine. There is also some relevance on the cloud side of things, the workloads that we host in places. And there certainly is hype around that. And there are some companies that also choose that as their platform for good reasons. I haven't looked at studies or actual data for that, but I'd expect that the vast majority of workloads is still x86. ARM does play a role, and I would expect it to play more of a role in the future, just out of efficiency reasons. But today, it's not what we're seeing.
You're saying you hadn't developed locally in 4 years. So that leads me to ask the next question. You're using Gitpod to build Gitpod?
Very, very early, like with the start of the prototype, essentially, like the prototype took about 3 months to build, 4 months to build. And from that moment on, we made the switch to develop Gitpod and Gitpod, and have been doing that ever since.
So this now gets me back to my original question that I sort of jumped the gun with. What made you want to build Gitpod? What was the pain that you were trying to solve?
It was exactly that which I described in the beginning. It's that you want to work on a project and it's just so painful to get started. And that's the pain that we wanted to solve. And so it might help to talk a bit about the place that Gitpod came from. So the sort of core DNA of the founders of the company and where it came out from was a consulting company. And Typefox, it is called. It still exists. We spun out of Typefox at some point. And Typefox built domain-specific languages and tooling around domain-specific languages. So Eclipse Xtext, in case you're familiar. On top, and in addition to sort of developer tooling in general. And so as a consulting business, they would go to other companies and need to familiarize themselves with their code base and their tooling and go through that sort of setup process over and over and over again. Also being deeply rooted in the open source community, they saw the same problem that folks who wanted to contribute would struggle to set up their environment and actually do contribute. And so the whole thing was driven out of a desire to lower the barrier to engage with such projects and at the same time enable a new way of working. So one of the earliest features that was put into Gitpod was PR reviews. Because PR reviews, even though say you've been working on the same project for a very long time, any PR review is likely to disrupt what you have locally. At the very least, you need to do a Git checkout to check out that particular branch. And then we all started to develop our own workarounds where we'd have multiple working copies of the same repository and try and remember the state of what's where. But then tooling around that might change as well. And some of that is global state. And so for PR reviews, we wanted to reduce the looks good to me kind of type review where you basically use GitHub or GitLab to just browse through the commits and go through that mental exercise of trying to understand what impact this is likely to have and provide a more hands-on experience where you can actually try the code, run the unit tests, and really interact with it in a way that does not change that global state on your machine.
So you called out GitHub and GitLab there specifically.
We also do support Bitbucket.
Now, you support all three. Mm-hmm. You support all three. But I'm curious, without giving, obviously, exact numbers, what do you see the split as across those three? Because I'm assuming those are the big three. Are there any others that you support today? Or is it only just those three?
Yeah.
And if you had to do a weighting between GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket, is it something like 70, 20, 10? Or even worse, one way or the other?
It's very hard to say. I want to say it depends really at the segment that you're looking at, but sort of GitHub and GitLab are all but equal. And then Bitbucket hardly plays a role, to be honest.
That's interesting. considering the strength of Atlassian.
Yeah, but Atlassian also, I think the Atlassian itself doubled down on some products and almost gave up on others. And I think that Bitbucket falls into the second category. You see that by the push that they are doing for integration with other tools, and they're really pushing now for, hey, how can our products work well with GitHub and GitLab? That gives you a clue, right?
It might also be a sampling result. Like, I'd wager that companies willing to adopt GitLab or GitHub, might also be more likely to adopt something like Gitpod. Like when I think about these categories of products and where I've encountered them, I would think of Bitbucket as sort of, I don't want to say something older, but, like they're more modern systems to adopt.
I think that Bitbucket had its moment in the past when companies were more inclined to take a big bundle from one vendor that will do it all, right? So we made a deal with Atlassian, we made a deal with IBM or with whomever, and they're going to give us all the tooling that we need, or at least as much of a tooling as we can get. We might end up with 2 vendors or 3 vendors, but kind of that's about it, right? We don't deal with more than that. I think that was a logic that was employed in the past. Now it's very different, right? I think that companies are looking for what is the tool that fits our needs the best, not what does our single vendor has in that area, right?
So you initially started out just in browser.
That's right.
Correct?
Yeah.
It was just in browser. When you made that decision, how much pain did you have to go through just dealing with browser types?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Now, fortunately, you came out after Netscape 4 and IE6.
Yeah, I think we hit a fortunate point in time there. Fortunate point in time. Maybe let's quickly speak to the reason why browser. Actually, it's not necessarily the obvious choice. And one of the reasons is that it gives the whole thing a much more lightweight kind of feel, and it allows like multitasking in the browser is very easy. We all do that day in, day out. I always joke the reason I got a 32 gig Mac is so I can have more tabs open. In the early days, we founded and developed Eclipse Thea. And Eclipse Thea is still a thing. It's quite a thing, actually. It's essentially an IDE framework, if you so like, for building IDEs, not just in the browser, but also on the desktop. So it runs in the browser and as an Electron app. And it is modeled to some degree after VS Code. It's not directly a VS Code clone. It makes some different trade-offs. For example, it is very well suited for white labeling and building dedicated applications that way. And there is some compatibility with VS Code. So it uses the Monaco editor that VS Code built. And it also supports VS Code extensions. And that's what we have been using for quite a while and actively developing. And then discovered that VS Code had sort of caught up and was now capable of running purely in the browser. And so once that became possible, we made the switch to VS Code in the browser. And that shifted the set of problems that we had to solve, and it also reduced that set. So in the beginning, it was quite painful. I remember discussions around discovering key bindings and working around the idiosyncrasies of how browsers deal with that. And we haven't had such a discussion in a long time.
Let me see if I understood that correctly. So basically, V1, we'll call it V1, was Thea. Mm-hmm. And then you've switched over now to using VS Code in the browser.
That's right. I want to say a couple of years ago.
I'm curious, Gitpod now supports, correct me if I use the wrong name, but remote development environments or preview environments from VS Code in a browser or VS Code on a desktop, right? It can work with both. Do you have any rough idea what is the preferable way to use it among Gitpod users? What is more common today?
So Gitpod supports a variety of means to access a workspace. VS Code as you said, VS Code in the browser, VS Code on the desktop. It is also SSH. Like you can just SSH into a workspace. And If you want to use Emacs or VI, you can do that. You can also use JetBrains products. So we have a strategic partnership with JetBrains where we support a good part of their IDEs with Gitpod as well. And we work very closely with them to make that happen. As to the split, this is hard to say because there is a good part of fluidity. What we see is that users don't necessarily fall into one or the other category, but will switch depending on their need. So I myself, for example, if I'm on the rare days that I get to work on a feature for an extended period of time, I'll very likely do that in the desktop. So I'll open my workspace in VS Code Desktop. And then for things like PR reviews or, hey, could you just help me with that real quick? I'll probably just open that in a tab just because it's a bit more convenient. And again, it does help with that multitasking. Yeah, people don't really fall into one or the other category necessarily.
It's very curious because it's almost the same as the pattern. I love the idea, and I use remote environments all the time. I cannot get rid of my VS Code for things I commonly work on. But then, hey, yeah, this open source project, I need to make some change for the first time and maybe never again, right? Then I go into a browser.
Yeah, what's important though is even though it's VS Code on my desktop, that doesn't mean that my actual environment lives on the desktop, right? My environment is still a workspace that runs somewhere else, and that is also not just a sort of dumb laptop in the cloud. It's not taking what we've been doing on laptops, which are essentially pets, right? To use that pet cattle analogy, development environments are or have for the longest time been pets. And there is a trend where some try and take pets and put them into the cloud, but they're still pets. You still have to invest into setting them up, and you still have to invest into keeping them up to date, and you still have to prevent configuration drift between what you're running and what your colleagues and collaborators are running. Whereas the thing that Gitpod does differently is it will create an environment for each and every task. The automation that is at the heart of Gitpod gets exercised very often, and we all know that automation that doesn't get exercised rots and breaks eventually. And so by exercising this very often, we prevent that. And because you create a new environment for every task, you'll also be up to date with regards to configuration. So someone changes the tooling, for example, we switch to Go 119, and then I open a workspace on main where that change has been merged, and now I get Go 119. And I don't have to manually go and update my laptop or my laptop in the cloud, if you so like, and do that manually. That is really a big benefit. Like the works on my machine problem is just gone.
Now, based on what you just said, and based on how the company is named, I'm assuming Gitpod, pod being the key word there, means that it isn't just a dumb laptop in the cloud. What does running something like Gitpod at scale mean to you?
So the key metrics sort of that we care for is, for example, workspace startup time, obviously also workspace success rate. And part of that is how long, like workspace startup time, for example, is how long does it take to start a workspace? So you click that button, or you add that to the URL of your repository. How long does it take to start a workspace? And optimizing for that is a perpetual challenge, a very interesting one. So shameless plug, at KubeCon, we'll have a talk on how we sped up image pulls using IPFS and opportunistic caching in IPFS. Part of what this means to me is perpetually trying to find ways to speed that up, and to also, so to make it more predictable, really. Like what speeding up means is right now the distribution has a very long tail, and it basically means cutting off that long tail. And it also means making it ever more reliable. We're essentially producing laptops out of a tissue box, if you so like. And so if that tissue box jams and you can't get your laptop, it means you can't work. And that's not a good experience.
We're recording this before KubeCon, so probably by the time you're listening to this, the KubeCon videos may be out. So go look for the session about what Chris was just talking about. Now, workspace startup times. What is that threshold that people say this is too slow?
It's very subjective.
Like for me, I'm okay because I understand what's going on, right? I understand I'm having to get code from X. I may be having to provision, going back to your Go 119 scenario. Okay, I'm having to get a new version of that. So I understand, okay, it's going to take time. So for me, especially on maybe the very first time, which we'll get into pre-builds in a minute, but the very first time, I'm okay with a minute or two, because if I think about it, if I was trying to pet and cattle this on my local machine, it could take me hours by the time I get my brew stuff set up correctly or chocolatey or whatever I'm using. So, a couple of minutes isn't a big deal to me first time. But ongoing, I would expect less than 15 to 20 seconds. Because I'm still okay with 15 to 20 seconds because I understand, okay, I'm not just starting up a game on my iPhone. There's a lot more stuff moving here.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. So the understanding for what happens behind the scenes and using that to gauge how long you're willing to wait is a very sensible approach. It does imply exactly that understanding, though. And so for many, especially first-time users, that's unreasonable to assume that they would have that. The absolute time, how long someone wants to wait or is willing to wait, is really a very subjective thing. I think the main driver is that it's predictable. You do that 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and you build up a mental model of how long it's going to take. And so these first 4 times, it took you 10 seconds to get a workspace. And then the 5th time, it takes 2 minutes. You're going to assume it's broken. It's exactly this predictability that is, in my mind, the defining quality. There's a point where bringing that time down has an impact on how people will use Gitpod. You're just more likely to actually create a new workspace if it doesn't take long to produce that.
So when we start working with Gitpod, if people have been listening up to this point, and it's like, okay, editor in the browser, or maybe I'm just using an extension out of VS Code or one of the JetBrains products, and I'm ready to get started, but I still don't believe you. Now, I come from the world to where back in the 90s, we weren't allowed to have anything on our local machines. We had to SSH into another machine to do our work. You could not do local coding. And our only tools that were allowed were VI and Emacs, because that's what was installed, and that we weren't allowed to X forward. We weren't allowed to do anything. It was all text. But now it's 2022. We have real tools. What is that experience like? Let's come out of the browser and let's go local IDE for a moment. What is that experience like just getting set up the first time?
It's near magical, especially if you've gone through the process of setting all that jazz up locally, and then you experience what it looks like doing that with Gitpod. It's a near magical experience. Like one of the best definitions of magic I've heard is, you look at something and you go like, that's fair. That makes sense. That's fair. That is what magic is. And with Gitpod, it's very similar. You do that for the first time and you observe what's happening, and there's feedback, pulling container image, initializing workspace content. You go like, I understand that. And then that thing opens and everything is there. And that's the what the moment in a very positive sense, right? Depending on the automation that is in place, how well that repository is configured, you'll even be greeted with running dev servers and a tab opening or a browser opening that serves whatever it is you're working on, or unit tests that have run, and you'll see the output of that. And so there's all this sort of state and things that have happened that you didn't need to do yourself, that produce a very empowering experience where you're just ready to go without having to spend hours in setting it up.
To me, I might be completely off the track and wrong right now, but to me, what is most interesting about Gitpod is the cultural change, especially in the context of inner source. It's absolutely amazing for open source, but I understand it's not that majority of people are contributing heavily. But before, in the past, still we have companies, and then people work. I work on this application period. whatever I need, I'm going to send you an email, and then pray to whichever deity I'm praying to that you do it by the time I need it, right? I see how beneficial Gitpod is for that single application I'm working on. But okay, I can live without it, right? In a way. But then that collaboration, hey, over all of a sudden, there is no obstacle really for me to jump into somebody else's project, somebody else's team, and do what I need that there to be done instead of waiting for somebody, right? That's in a way almost similar to that shift left movement, even though this is not really shift left, but hey, I'm enabled now to actually go outside of specific expertise that I'm working on and do the stuff. I'm not sure how off I am now in the real world usages of Gitpod, but to me that inner source sounds like a really huge change, potentially huge change at least.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. There's a small step that happens before where, because of the ease that Gitpod provides in setting up development environments, it facilitates play and exploration. You're much more likely to engage with a different code base just because the barrier to exploring that code base, to trying out what it is they're building and to browse through, is so much lower now. And before that, you'd have to clone the repo, you'd have to go through an outdated README and understand what tools you need and what environment variables need to be set how and what paths need to be in what, and it would break something else that you're actually working on, and all of that just goes away. So the cost of exploring code, exploring projects is reduced to near zero, other than the time that you need to invest, like in actual exploration rather than the setup.
There is a huge difference, and that's why I was mentioning this, right? There's a huge difference in the amount of pain I'm willing to go through to set up something that I'm working on day after day after day after day, right? And if that can be reduced, I think that's great. But then there is that exploration, right? My pain threshold is very different for your project, Darin, that I'm going to contribute tomorrow and maybe never again, or 3 months later, and something I'm working on every single day, right? So I think that there are different thresholds over there.
And also for those who enjoy the setup, you can still do that, except now you have a sandbox that limits the blast radius should something go wrong. So if you enjoy this kind of setup and you want to walk through that, for one, you're now given a sort of machine reproducible description of how that setup looks like. So you can have the learning with less pain. If you do enjoy the pain, then, and like the specific pain of setting something up because you believe that someone has to go through this rite of passage before they're worthy of contributing to a repository, and you need to go through that rite of passage yourself, and there is that belief in some, then maybe we have some more work to do on meeting somewhere where that makes sense for all of us. I'd argue that most developers really care for what it is they can create, what change they can affect. And there is little value in massaging your own local setup. Like there can be joy in that, and there can be play and exploration in that. And so that you still have, right? You can still go and try the individual tools. And as I said, now you even have a sandbox in which you can do that, where, if you decide that that didn't work, you just close the tab and you're good. But if I want to actually work on something that creates value for others, an open source project, inner source, an actual product, not that those things are exclusive. Now I'm much more empowered to do that just because I can get right to doing it, and I don't have to go through this effort and rite of passage thing before.
Now, when I think about it, that's not much different than, let's say, CI/CD pipelines or infrastructure as code, in terms that we all started at one point, at least we as older ones, right, by writing readmes or wiki pages or what's or not. And at one moment, we continue doing the same thing, except in a different format, right? Instead of writing a wiki page, we translated that knowledge into a Jenkins pipeline, right? Or Terraform HCL or Ansible something, right? I found that extremely useful because even if I never use the Terraform module or even if I never use that pipeline, right? It's a clear workable documentation. It's almost like the reasons why we do automated tests instead of manual testing, right? It's a working documentation in a way. Even if you never use it, you know exactly what needs to be done because you've been testing it every single day, multiple times a day, right?
Yeah, it's so funny. Development environments are sort of the last bastion that have not turned into code yet. I mean, with Gitpod that changes, but everything else we've turned into code. It started with how we test and how we set up how we integrate. I remember the first job I had, I was that poor chap who every Friday got to pull Java code out of ClearCase, compile that Java code, stick it into an Oracle database, and run that on Solaris machines. Like, if you put all these things together, you can imagine the kind of hell that was. Then along came cruise control. And I remember sort of what breath of fresh air that was, that these things could now happen automatically. Unfortunately, the monitor that we set up in the hallway to show if the build was green was just constantly red, but that's a different story. We, like turning this into code and turning this into something a machine can do rather than me having to do that every Friday was a fundamental change. And it also helped empower the team get better feedback on exactly the integration of the code. And so there we moved to code. And then with infrastructure, we did the same. We moved towards infrastructure as code rather than having that in the heads of select few who would then go and execute magic commands or click through a UI. It is now something that is versioned and reviewed and handled very much like code and can be executed by a machine. And our development environments are the obvious thing to follow suit. Until now, before Gitpod, essentially, you would need to also execute magic commands and click through UI and follow an outdated README. And what happens now is we turned this README into essentially something machine readable. And so it is now executed for you, and it's no longer your own job to do that. In my mind, this is a very logical consequence of the path that we as an industry have been on. And looking forward, imagine you were to join a company right now and they go like, "No, we don't do continuous integration. Like, there's Pete. He does that every Friday." You'd go like, "What's wrong here? Like, okay, I'm out probably, or we need to fix this if you're brave." And I would imagine that I'd wager that in 4 or 5 years, it's very much the same with remote development environments. Like, you join a company and they go like, "Here's your laptop. Here's your README. See you in a week when you're set up." And you go like, "What do you mean, see you in a week? Like, where's that button I can click?" I think we'll move in very much the same direction.
There is also that other side of SaaS, I believe, right? That it all started probably with Amazon that opened completely new avenues by saying, "Hey, your virtual machines can be managed by somebody else." Whether that somebody else is a third party or first party, that not important now, right? And then 10 years later or 15 years later, that expanded into almost everything is SaaS today, right? You want monitoring, it's SaaS. You want database, it's SaaS. And then that begs again what you call a logical question or evolution or whatever kind of, hey, why is development environment exception? Kind of, why does using a virtual machine for my production or staging environment, why is that okay? And using virtual machine for dev environment, well, essentially, okay, or let's put it this way, right? What is conceptual difference between production and development environments? I mean, I know that there are differences in terms that one needs a compiler and the other one doesn't. I mean, but those are technical differences. But conceptually, why do we accept that production is managed by somebody else and development environments are not?
That's a great question.
Is it because developers are kind of, a special breed in terms of, if I don't do it, if I don't reinvent the wheel myself, then it's not good. Is that the thing?
I think that's one extreme end of that spectrum. But indeed, there is an aspect to developers. We like to understand and be able to tinker with things and to customize things. And there's value in that. There's learning in that. Development environments are this to some very personal thing. I got my themes, I got my shell aliases, I got my hotkeys, I got all of that set up to just how I need it. My Vim RC is 10,000 lines, something like that. So to some extent, as developers, we take pride in this customization. And that's sort of an extreme, again, like an extreme, almost exaggerated, almost like a caricature, but there's a kernel of truth to that. And I think that's the key difference towards production infrastructure. In production infrastructure, we aim to have that as reproducible, as harmonized, as homogeneous as possible. And with development environments, there's a lot of benefit in homogeneity. There's also a cost to it. If you've ever worked at a large company where someone figured that it would be a good idea to centralize development environments for every single developer in this 10,000 people company, and you have to work with that standardized environment, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not a pleasure to work in that. So the thing that we need to get right is the trade-off between sort of harmonization, standardization, automation, and customization. The ability to provide you with a good setup and yet give you the ability to customize this and make you feel at home. And part of this is the ways you can access your environment, be it in the browser, be it on the desktop, be it via shell. Part of it is what you can bring to that environment. For example, Gitpod supports dot files where you can, list a repository. We'll clone that repo and we'll install those dot files at the startup of a workspace. And so you can customize your workspace that way. I think that's one of the main reasons we haven't seen, until recently, a proliferation of sort of standardized or cloud-based development environments.
That's interesting. Here's a question, or maybe future request. Can we have both? Can we have some kind of a mechanism to have a standardized environment combined with another mechanism to have personalized components in it? Because let's say that my standardized environment for this project X uses Bash, and among many other things, but I want to always have Z shell in that environment. So I'm obviously not going to modify Gitpod or whatever the file is, because everybody agreed on Bash, but I want for myself to have Z shell. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I think to a great extent we're already doing that, and navigating this trade-off is one of the sort of perpetual challenge in product design that we face. Where do you put what? For example, the choice of the IDE is a good example. Is that something that should be harmonized across the project, or is that a developer's personal choice? And I think the answer to that question actually depends on who you ask. Different people will have different takes on that. So for one, it's not always that clear cut, and then it's up to us to create the right possibilities to match. So one of our core values is integrate, don't dictate. We want to provide a surface that lets you bring the tools and way of working that you're used to and make your life better, rather than dictate and force our perspective on how things ought to work on you. That doesn't mean we're never opinionated. Clearly, we do make decisions within the product and do have certain opinions. Yet we want to have sort of a large surface that you can build on and work with.
Yeah, but that's opinionation. So there are 3 levels, right? There is a Gitpod level, and I think that you're doing a great job there. That you're opinionated, but then through .gitpod file, I can override that opinion on a project level. And I'm creating a feature request. Can I overwrite part of that opinionation on my personal level, in a way, right? I'm not sure where I would put that opinion or file, because it couldn't be in a repo, but something like that.
It's hard to say that in general, I think. For example, coming back to the shell, right? Which shell you want to use. You could bring a set of dot files that write to your bash RC and then just spawn that into Z-shell. Not sure that that's a viable way, but there is some ways you could customize that space for you, or other things. For example, if you're using VS Code, no matter if on the desktop or in the browser, you can select themes, you can select extensions, you can select, like, your settings will be synchronized across multiple workspaces. So you can customize this way, sort of sitting on top of sort of the base level automation that is decided on a team level.
So if people wanted to get started with Gitpod, they go out to gitpod.io. They pay you $100 a month.
No, they pay us $25 a month, and we'll give them a free version of Gitpod.
So actually,
That's not true either.
Nice try, though. Now, you can go to gitpod.io and try Gitpod for free, 50 hours a month. Use it, actually. Like, that's the reason is we want people to really use Gitpod. We want people to discover what it can do, and we want people to use that to, for example, contribute to open source. We're a very large sort of proponent of open source. We do fund open source projects directly. We do fund them through Gitpod workspace hours. And so go to gitpod.io, and there is a getting started guide. Or if you're on GitHub or GitLab and you're in a repository and you want to try that with Gitpod, just put gitpod.io/hash in front of that URL, hit return, and you'll get a workspace on that particular repository.
That is the most magical thing out of anything you've said today. I mean, I understand how you're doing it, but still, I don't have to go and look for a button. I just have to know the magic phrase to put in front of the URL.
That's right. And the buttons that we do provide, so on GitHub, we have a browser extension that you can install. We have a native integration in GitLab. And all those buttons do is they put exactly gitpod.io/hash in front of the URL that's in your browser and open that.
So we're talking SaaS, but there's also a self-hosted version.
That's right.
For those people that are still air-gapped.
Yes, that is a thing.
It is a very big thing, actually.
Yes. That's right. There is an air-gapped there is a self-hosted version that you can run air-gapped as well. I'd encourage to start out on SaaS and see how far that gets you. The main reason for that is it lets you experience what you can do before diving into the complexities of self-hosted. So as you can imagine, Gitpod is not the easiest system to operate just because of what it does. What makes it hard is that the workloads that you're going to run are so unpredictable because, users can do essentially whatever they want within a workspace. And so it can be anything from like a language server that's just ticking by almost idly to someone spinning up, Clang or Rust C and wanting to eat all your memory and RAM. And making that work reliably is a perpetual challenge. There is a self-hosted version. There's also a local preview, as we call it, which is essentially a Docker container that you can run locally. There's a host of caveats and limitations with it, of course. It does let you try Gitpod within your particular environment, though. So that's on gitpod.io/docs. You'll find the documentation for that walks you through.
But start with the SaaS. Even if it's not in your environment, go pick an open source repository that you want to update some docs for. And go through that process, because I'm assuming the self-hosted experience is still exactly the same as what SaaS is.
That's right.
Plus or minus a few days.
Yes.
Because I'm assuming it takes a few moments to bake the self-hosted environment to make it installable. Whereas in the SaaS, you said, click, oh, it's already out there. Well, Chris, thanks for being with us today. If people wanted, now, all of Chris's information will be down in the show notes, but if people wanted to get in touch with you, Chris, what's the best way to do that?
Reach out on Twitter. My handle is @CSWeichel. We'll probably put that in the show notes. That's probably the easiest way. Otherwise, KubeCon will already be over. But we'll also be hanging around at other conferences. So we've been to DevOps in Belgium. Yeah, we'll go to KubeCon. We'll go to the next KubeCon. And find us at conferences where we give talks. Or, even better, join our community. Gitpod has a large community of people all around developer experience, all around Gitpod. we're very active on Discord. Go join our community.
So your community is on Discord.
Yeah.
Okay. We could talk for a whole nother hour about that. We're not going to get into the reasons why Discord versus Slack. But there you go. Chris, thanks for being with us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.